Right, so thanks for coming, and hopefully this is going to be interesting. The idea is to go faster with Ansible, but before we get onto that, my name is Richard Donkin. I'm a sort of DevOps engineer. I have been a sort of back-end developer, sysadmin, CTO, startup person, enterprise person, telecoms, lots of different things in my career. But I just decided to, stop doing the variety and just focus down on DevOps because it's really interesting in terms of what it can do for the business. Of integrating the development side, which is now agile, with the QA, which is hopefully agile too, but also the operations and the sysadmin, and also extending out into security and compliance and all sorts of other weird stuff. So it's basically like agile, but covering more stuff, including your servers, sort of the DevOps thing. So this is all about going faster. So what does that mean? Clearly you've got to go faster, but not get things wrong at the same time. It's really easy to get things wrong. People do it all the time. So you need to somehow configure your servers and deploy your applications and configure your developers' laptops in the correct way, but also blindingly fast. So you have one command to provision a whole server, one command to deploy your app, one command to set up a developer laptop. And this presentation is mostly about how you do that. We're giving you a bit of context first, and then we're going to get into the actual and how Ansible works, and talk about and actually show you Ansible working live on a couple of different things, including Drupal at the end if we're lucky. So correct configuration means things like not having snowflake servers, which just means avoiding the syndrome where you have lots of different servers which are unique. And there's a config over there that Jim knows, and Fred knows the config on that server, and it's slightly different. And if you had to rebuild them from scratch, you'd be in trouble because they've been there for years, and no one's really documented exactly what's been done all the time. So that's where things like Ansible come in. They are a way of doing code that controls a config, but they're also sort of executable documentation as well. So it helps you sort of control and avoid this snowflake syndrome. So you've got to cover dev, test, and production. And fundamentally, the way you do that is what's called infrastructure as code. You may have come across this if you're a DevOpsy person, but it just means something like Ansible or Puppet or Chef, which is controlling all your server configs. And increasingly, if you've got cloud-based servers, it's creating the servers for you as well. So if you've got something like AWS, it will actually use the APIs to create stuff too. And what that lets you do is take the code that you've got, which is creating all the server configs and doing the deployment, and treat it like all the other code that you have as application developers. So you can do version control, you can review it with your peers, you can go through normal QA, you can write automated tests for this infrastructure code, and you can push it to servers, of course, automatically. And it just enables a collaboration between dev and ops, because you're sort of forced to, because you have to get the code reviewed and agreed and all the rest. So you tend to put the Ansible person, either they're just a developer or they're a sysadmin with some development skills, and they're often in the development team to do that. So that's really my definition of configuration management. There's lots of bigger, wordier definitions, but it's fundamentally code that controls the config of your underlying server and your app. Okay. So what Ansible actually does is more than configuration management. It's application deployment as well, and also orchestration. So to dig into that, the basic application deployment is just one command in Ansible to say, push all the files somewhere onto your servers. It could be a Git pull, or it could be something else that you do. Restart the services, make sure that the application comes up again, and then you're done. So there's a bit of downtime, but that's often okay in lots of applications. It will be probably less downtime, in terms of there won't be any mistakes, and also it will be very quick because it's all automated. So it's often okay for that. There's also what I call an atomic deployment scenario where, has anyone come across Capistrano? That sort of thing? Rocketeer, I think there's something similar, yeah. So Capistrano is a tool from the Ruby world where you can use it for PHP as well, but it's fundamentally a tool to deploy in such a way that you have one release tree for the current version of the app on the server today. You deploy a new release tree in a different folder for the version you're about to go live with. And then you have a symbolic link pointing to the current version. You flip it over to the new version, and so it's like an atomic deploy, and you have even less downtime then, which is quite good. And then the more advanced sort of zero downtime, if you want to have a truly highly available app, you have a whole tier of web servers, you have load balancers, and you actually take the web servers out of the load balancer with Ansible. You provision it, do all the sort of normal stuff you would do in the basic deploy, so it actually simplifies it in a way, and then you put it back in. And one of the nice things about Ansible is it makes that orchestration bit really easy, which is really just sequencing operations across cloud servers, APIs, and all the rest. Deployment is one big example, but there are other ones too. So And generally speaking, you could have a totally different tool to do that other than config management tools. And often people would have a totally different tool because Puppet and Chef are not great at doing configuration management generally. But Ansible, because it has a simpler approach, it can do the orchestration stuff too. Okay. So Ansible is sort of good for a few different reasons. One of them is that you don't have to install anything on your server. If it has SSH and if it has Python, or you can install Python easily, then you can configure that with Ansible, which is quite nice. You also don't need to deploy a new sort of server just to host Ansible somewhere. You can if you want to. If you want to have just one place that runs all the commands, but it doesn't have any state. It just has a git pull from your Ansible repository. You don't have, if you have some other configuration management system, they're a lot more involved to deploy. They involve lots of interesting databases like Amnesia, which is written in Erlang for Chef, etc. But they also have, the fact you have state in terms of the database has to be managed, and it tracks all the state of your servers, etc. So it becomes quite complex to keep that running. Ironically, people sometimes use Ansible to deploy the Puppet agent because it's just quicker and easier to do that than to use Puppet. It's also just generally simple. They try not to put lots of advanced features in if they're not absolutely necessary, but it can do pretty much everything the other guys can do. It just tries to avoid some of the complexity. And part of that is saying that you don't if you have a set of tasks to be done on a server to sort of install PHP, configure MySQL, install Nginx, you can just put those in a whole set of sequential tasks in a what's called a playbook in a script, and it will do them in that order, which sounds really obvious, right? But Puppet and some of the other ones tend to have a more complicated model where they figure out all the dependencies and all the things you need to go from the current state of the server to the desired state, all the files that need to be changed and reconfigured, etc. And then it will execute stuff in whichever order it thinks is best. And it's much harder to debug because it's a declarative, dependency-driven approach like a makefile. Speaking of declarative, it has got at the lower level, when we get onto tasks, as you'll see, there's this concept of a task in Ansible which says such and such must be done. This package must be installed, this file must be configured with this template. But if you run it twice, it doesn't do the same thing again. It just checks and says, oh, that's been done already. So that's what's called idempotence. You can run the same thing many, many times and there's no bad effects. On a project I'm actually working on at the moment, I early on had a legacy shell script I was porting to Ansible, and it did this very same thing of putting some SSH config in so the backup tool could get into the server, and that's fine. But when you run the tool, that shell script again, you actually can't get into SSH anymore. So you have to destroy the server. Luckily, it was on my dev laptop. So idempotence is not just a theoretical thing. It can cause you to lose access to your server in extreme cases. So it's pretty easy to learn. It's good at this sort of complex orchestration thing. But I think the more important thing is to get on to installing and demo. So it's a one-line install, which is really pretty quick if you're on a Mac. And it's 2 lines on Debian and Red Hat, etc. And if you want to, you can install it through the Python packaging tool. I have to admit, it is written in Python, not PHP. But you don't need to know Python to use it. You just have to install this thing called pip, the packaging tool, and then you do basically pip install Ansible. Once you've done that, you can then choose the latest version or an older version or whatever you require, which is quite useful if you're trying to just check in case it's an Ansible bug or your code. So on to the demo. So anyone familiar with PHP Mailer? What happened a week or 2 ago? Yeah. So for those who weren't, there was a big security hole. It probably hit loads and loads of PHP apps, and everyone had to quickly deploy a fix, right? So this is an example of using Ansible to deploy the fix. But it's actually a very simple thing to do. And you might say, well, hang on, I could just run apt-get install on all my servers. And yeah, you can, but you just have to log into every server and do that. And this is like the lowest level of Ansible just to get you into the concept of it. You can do more complicated things too. So if I go back up here, lots of stuff here. All right, tell you what. Did have all this set up and then I had to reboot the laptop. Okay, so what we're going to do here, is that big enough for you to see at the back? I can make it bigger. Okay. We're just running this playbook. It's called phpmailer.yml. -i dev is pointing at a thing called the inventory, which is a list of servers, which I'll come on to a bit later. And this is going to take, okay, it actually has done it. Okay, so it's basically running 3 tasks. The first one is a built-in one, which is implicit, which just says setup, which is gathering facts about the server, saying how many cores, how much RAM, what operating system version, what IP address is, a whole bunch of things, which comes back as a big JSON blob and then populates variables you can use in your scripts. And then there's that one is green because it always succeeds, and that's not it. Let me rephrase that. There's a concept of idempotence in Ansible means that you end up having things colored in that yellow color if things have changed, and colored in green, as you'll see on the next run, if they haven't changed. So the second task is to update apt to get all the packages, all the details of all the latest versions of the packages downloaded, like an apt-get update on Debian. And that's actually had to do something. And then updating PHPMailer, it's also had to change something there, i.e. PHPMailer was not on the latest version, or it wasn't installed. So it's actually done that there. And at the bottom, you can see there's a little recap which says there are 3 tasks run, and 2 of them had to change something. So if we run it again, you'll see it will actually do very similar stuff, a little bit quicker, because it's now gone to green on the apt cache thing and green on the update PHPMailer, which just means that its idempotence is working. It's doing the right thing. If it's got nothing to do, it'll just skip over it. That's all it's doing. So it's a simple concept, but it's behind all of Ansible, so it's worth sort of reiterating. Okay. By the way, if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to just raise a hand and I'll try and answer them, or we can have them at the end. So a playbook is basically a series of tasks. It runs on a set of servers defined by that inventory file, which could be all of your servers or just the web servers or just servers defined by some other criterion. And it could just be running on one server or thousands of servers. There are people running Ansible against like 10,000 servers, and it scales quite well for that. You would obviously not run that off your laptop. You'd run it on a server of some sort that has a few more cores, but you can't do that. Okay? And I already talked about what the tasks do. There's a concept of a play in Ansible you'll see, and all that is a set of tasks in the playbook. Normally there's just one play. You can have more than one play if you want to, and there's some. It's a slightly more advanced thing as to when you need that, but you can do that. So this is just recapping what we saw, which I won't go into. So on to actually writing the playbook. So at the top you've got the play, which is where it says host : all, become : yes, and then you've got a number of tasks. This is one we've just run. And each one starts usually with a name, which is what you actually saw printed out. So it's sort of a comment, but it's also a description for the person running the playbook. And then you have an invocation of a module. In this case, it's apt, which is the managing apt-get, etc. on Debian and Ubuntu. And it's saying, first of all, I want you to update the cache, as in the cache of all the packages. But it's saying, don't do it if it was done in the last hour. So that's why when I ran it again straight away, it said, oh, it's nothing to do. It's within the time. The cache expiry time. And then the second part is pretty self-descriptive. You just give it the package name, say either stated latest or just stated present. If it's present, then that means if it's some version of PHPMailer, that's okay. In this case, that would be a mistake. Here you want the latest version, but it depends on what you're trying to achieve with the package. Okay. So under the covers, when you run this stuff, every task that you have in a playbook actually runs some SSH commands. They go onto the server. They upload a module. It actually really does upload the Python code, but it's fairly succinct, so it's not much. Doesn't take much time to do that. You then run the module with those parameters that you saw, and then it returns a JSON blob as output, which it will then parse for you, and it will show you some attributes of that, such as if you see changed false and changed true, that's what drives the color of is it green or yellow, and is it okay or changed. Okay, so it's all driven by the modules, and you can write your own modules which don't actually have to be in Python. They could be in PHP or Go or whatever language you want. It's just most of them in the public repositories are in Python. Now the inventory is sort of fairly basic at this level. It's just a text file which is in the ini format. You've got a group called web and a group called db, and they do what you think. They're just a way of saying, I want to talk only to my DB servers or my web servers or whatever. You can also put in some variables. Variables, weirdly, in Ansible, are actually just fixed parameters. They do nothing. They tend not to change during the execution of a playbook, but that's just the name they've chosen. So think of them as parameters more than variables. I mean, you can actually do stuff with your own variables, but they're slightly different. And when you run it, you can specify here a different inventory like prod, I tend to recommend people don't have all their servers in one big inventory file. You can do that, but then if you run some particularly damaging command and you forget to put the -limit web to limit it to a certain category of servers, like web-dev for your development web servers, you might regret it. So it's kind of good to A, have a separate inventory file, and B, to possibly encrypt the parameters that you need for production, which you can do very easily. And some of them may be secrets anyway, like database passwords. There's a thing called Ansible Vault that lets you do that. But some people decide to encrypt all their production parameters just because that way you have to put a password into Ansible in order to provision production. Just a little extra safeguard. But it depends on your processes and all that sort of stuff as to whether you need that. So the -limit web thing just says only do the stuff in one group, and there's various other ways to control that. And one other thing I recommend is to try to use, try not to put variables in the actual inventory file at all. Here we've just got things like the Ansible port number. The SSH port is something different for the web servers, but you'll frequently have vast sums of parameters, like the Drupal config, which I can show you is about 100, 150 lines long, covering all the different things that are on that Drupal example server. What you can do is create a directory called group vars, and then you can put something in it, which is like my group, like the web, and then you can have a number of YAML files under there. You can just have one if you want, or you can have one for Apache, one for MySQL, or whatever, however you want to structure it. So Ansible gives you a lot of scope to structure things and do them in a sort of a modular, reasonably well-structured way. Okay. So we're going to actually run this in a second, but I wanted to show you a sort of more realistic playbook. And this is actually extracted from a real-world playbook, or real-world role, from a guy called Jeff Geerling, who's written quite a good book that I've got details on at the end. And one thing you notice, all the variables start with the word Apache, and that's usually because you want to scope the variables because they're all global, and so people tend to prefix them with the the domain or the service or the role or whatever. And essentially what you're saying in this playbook is I've got a fixed set of parameters for this playbook, which is really just for demo purposes. You probably wouldn't write it like this in real life. And for example, the listening IP, that really wouldn't be in a playbook at all. That would be off in the inventory. So that's an example where it lives in one of those vars files under the group vars folder. You can also just put these into separate include files that are called directly from the playbook. And there's various different ways of structuring it. And I forgot to mention earlier that you can actually have the inventory being not just in an ini file. It could be your EC2 live instances are the inventory. And then any tags you put on EC2 are retrieved by a sort of dynamic inventory script that plugs into Ansible. So essentially you'll manifest as Ansible inventory items, as servers, all the things you do inventory with all the tags you put onto them in EC2. Similarly, you can do that for DigitalOcean or other services too. It's really easy to write these scripts to just pull the stuff back and turn it into JSON. So there's a lot of stuff you can do if you don't want to have a flat inventory file too. So moving on with this playbook, it's a very similar thing. It's just updating apt, it's installing Apache, and then this part is slightly more advanced. It's using a templating feature built in. There's a thing called Ginger 2, which is a sort of web templating engine that some Python projects use. And it uses that to essentially template the local file, the vhost.conf over there, and it will then copy that up to the server and put that instance variable in there, which is the configuration path that you can work out. And those two curly braces are what it uses to indicate a variable. And then it will do a thing called a notify, which is sending an event to another specialized task called a handler. And that's basically saying, well, as you can see, restart Apache. The idea of that is if you've got like 100 things going on, lots and lots of different tasks, 5 of them might require Apache to be restarted. Like if you change this config file or if you change that config file, then you should restart Apache. You don't want to restart it 5 times. So instead, you have a handler which receives these events and it will restart just once at the end of the playbook. And it can do other things like notify Slack, send a message to Jenkins, or whatever your process dictates. This is actually the handler at the end. There's a bit here which restarts the service, or sorry, it actually makes sure the service is ready to start on boot. And it doesn't matter whether you're using systemd or sysvinit on the server, it just handles that for you. And this actually does the restart. As I said, it receives the event and it just says, right, restart required. Okay, so more demo. So it's running a few more things, and pretty much what I showed you, but there's one addition as well. This is where we see if the Wi-Fi is any good. The patch is a bit bigger. There you go. One at the end is that it's testing whether Apache responds with a web page or not, but I'll get into testing in a second as to how I wrote that. And there's lots of ways to test these playbooks and of different levels of sophistication too. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I should just ask: has anyone used Ansible already? Like a few of you. Yeah. Okay. Anyone used on the other tools like Puppet or Chef? Okay. So actually, quite a lot. Yeah. And who's using like shell scripts to provision servers? Yeah. And who's using hand configuration? Be honest. What? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, on your laptop is sort of very common, but I'm talking really about the servers and stuff. But okay, so actually you're in pretty good shape. If none of you how many are using Docker, by the way? Okay, so a few. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, I have put my hand up. I have configured Snowflake servers in the past. So it's not a sin. It's worth avoiding it. But before I got into the Ansible world. Yeah. Okay. And sorry. Yeah.
You've ensured Apache is configured. You've changed a configuration setting, and you've then tested there's a web page there, and then you've restarted it. Was there a reason why you tested it before restarting it?
This is because I haven't implemented the feature I put into my project code recently, which is it's called a thing called flush. You've spotted a deliberate bug. Thank you. There's a thing called flush handlers in Ansible, which says, it's only really for this sort of case where you want to get all the services restarted and then do the test. And so if you put in it's a command called meta : flush handlers, that will then say, okay, whatever's happened, run all the handlers now, right? And then you see the restarts being triggered and anything else that had a handler, and then you would run the test. So yeah, good point. I will fix that. Thank you. Any other really good questions spotting bugs?
I had a quick one.
Yeah.
You say it's sort of spawning individual SSH things. Does it screen on, upload them and run them, or does it run them in a transaction? I mean, what happens if you lose connection to a server partway through a playbook?
Okay, so it's not transactional in any sense. All that would happen is that it would imagine. It's happened to me actually, because my Mac, my famously reliable Mac, rebooted on me for no reason, and it was in the middle of running a provision on a local VM and a remote VM, and it was interesting seeing what happened. And I found out the VirtualBox will corrupt your file system if you don't configure it correctly. Different story. Well, all right, a slight digression, but if you don't configure the disk flush in VirtualBox, it will corrupt your file system, and I got real evidence for that. Anyway, so what happens is that it will just, next time you run the playbook, it will just start again, and it will go through from the very, very beginning, and then it will sort of hit one task which will have been incomplete, and it will basically just redo it. And as long as your task is something like installing a package, it's up to the package manager like apt-get as to whether that can survive that sort of event. So there may be some cases, an extreme event like the server crashing or losing connection or something like that, where you might have to do a bit of recovery in certain cases for certain tasks, but it's fairly rare. And you can write more complicated playbooks, but it may be better to write a separate playbook, which is like recover my APT state, because there are ways of doing that programmatically and not have to run that every time. Or you could run that recovery thing at the start of every playbook, if that's a problem for you. I haven't had that one myself, but when the server crashed, I did have that example. Okay.
So there isn't a way to kind of screen onto it, in air quotes, and like upload what you're going to do and have that run whether you lose.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So you can do that. So classically, Ansible runs from a control machine, or and then you have your target server. If you want, and that's called push mode. You can also have pull mode, where you have the Ansible repo. You do a git pull onto the local server, hence the name, and then you just run Ansible locally on the server. So then there's no SSH connection to be lost. So, yeah, that might be better in some environments. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So, in terms of modules, there's a ludicrous number of modules. About a year or two ago, it was 300 modules, and that's for 840. And these are all in the box. You don't have to download anything extra to get them. They're just part of the installing Ansible. So all the stuff you'd expect, like compose and pair and other language package managers. yum and apt get and so on, and the new one called DNF from Red Hat, and also Git, but also copying and templating files around, editing them in place. If you've got like a bit of a snowflakey server, you might have to just coexist with admins who are still editing the same config file, but it will actually edit it in a careful way, and Ansible managed around it. So you have some idea as an admin that you shouldn't edit that bit because it'll get stomped on. It's a bit dangerous, but you can still do that if you want to. And the services stuff I talked about, systemd and sysvinit, cron tabs, and hundreds of other stuff, other things that are probably not so relevant to everybody, but somebody wanted them, so they wrote it. Lots of databasey stuff. And it can also do firewall stuff on your Linux box, but also you can actually directly program routers and switches, which don't even run Python. So it can work in the sort of raw mode and do stuff like that, which they're having a bit of a push towards. They're also pushing towards trying to manage Windows as well. But it's less mature. If you're using Windows, I probably would look at Puppet or Chef. They're more mature for Windows, frankly. But you can do it in Ansible, but you have to be more dedicated, I think, to do it. Generally speaking, it runs much better on Linux and Unix. And obviously, it's got tons of support for AWS. The AWS modules alone are almost 90 now. And it's got DigitalOcean, various other modules, etc. But it's purely because AWS has been around a long time. It's very popular, of course. And interestingly, it's not... it's something you can use with Docker, or you can use Docker completely by itself and just use Docker files. But if you want to have a very sophisticated config going onto your Docker containers, it might be simplified because it's now in small containers per app. There's still a need, as you get more and more complex, to have something to manage it, and you need to be able to rebuild that Docker image efficiently. So there are people who actually use Ansible and Puppet and Chef to rebuild Docker images and have a control over which images get built and how. So that is one approach, and there are people doing it. And you can fall back to shell, etc. So you don't have to have a module for everything. You can just run a shell command, of course. So slightly more advanced, and we're going to see this in the Drupal example at the end, is the concept of roles. So the idea is if you've got 630 tasks in a set of Ansible scripts, which is a real number from Drupal, from this example I'll show you, then you don't want that in one big playbook. So how do you modularize the playbooks? You can use include files, but that's fairly limited. The role approach is much better. So it takes the three main things you have in the playbook I showed you. So you've got the vars, the tasks, and the handlers. And in this case, I'm imagining you've done it all in one for Apache and PHP. And you would then split that out into an Apache role and a PHP role and maybe a separate PHPFPM role as well. And each one of those is essentially a directory, and you have directories underneath it for the tasks, the vars, and the handlers. And you have an extra one for defaults, which is sort of vars that can be overridden easily because they're much lower precedence and they're very easy to override with inventory and stuff like that. So that's what you should normally put all your vars into, the defaults folder, not the vars folder, which is perhaps a bit confusing. The vars are more like constants for magic numbers if you don't ever want anyone to tinker with them. Like it will probably break your role, but you want it to be separate from the actual code. And the meta folder is partly if you want to upload to the repository, the shared hub called Galaxy, which I'll talk about. But it's also so you can say, before you run this role, run that role. So you could say PHPFPM has a dependency on the PHP role, because it makes no sense to run it without PHP installed. Right? So that's the basic concept of roles. And they are very important. Try and use roles for everything. It's kind of a mistake to think, oh, it's a bit complicated, I'll wait, don't have the complexity. Actually, it's simpler to use roles. Just force yourself to create the role stuff. There's a single command in Galaxy to create all the folders for you, and it does a bit of template, boilerplate for you. And then you should end up with really skinny playbooks, which mostly just call roles. You should really just have like 10, 20 role calls, and that's it. You shouldn't have loads of tasks in there. And in that example, if you've got MySQL, Apache, PHP, PHP, all those things can be separate roles. And then all those are part of your server setup playbook, which is one thing. And that is run whenever you get new servers, and it can be run continuously to make sure they're all aligned if you add some new config to that playbook. And then you have a deploy app playbook, which could be using some of the stuff I talked about earlier, but that's a different thing, and it should be in a totally different playbook because you're going to run that whenever your app changes, and it's not something that should be run continuously from a cron tab, for example. It should be run with somebody looking at it and checking that it makes sense and so on. And a final thing on roles is try to use a thing called wrapper roles. So Chef and Puppet have had some great ideas in their history. They are great tools in themselves, and one thing they came up with is if you have a third-party role like MySQL from somebody who's just written a great role that does it all really well, you then want to do 2 or 3 things that are different. Rather than forking the role, you could then say, I'm going to have a role with a dependency on that generic one, and run that, and then after that, I'm going to run my 2 or 3 tasks to do something different. It's a very simple idea, but it's better than putting it into a playbook or putting the vars into the inventory or something. So. Okay, so Galaxy is a really good place to find literally thousands of roles. You can discover them all through Galaxy, etc. But you can also discover roles through GitHub and just Googling, etc., and seeing how many stars things have got on GitHub. So there are some amazingly good roles on Galaxy, and there are some not so good roles. So you can either, take a lot of time assessing the quality, or you can just dive in, try one out, see if it works. But do test it out and make sure you understand what it's doing before you sort of go ahead and say that's what you're going to use. And there's this Ansible Galaxy command to do all the stuff for roles. I mentioned it does the boilerplate for you, but you can also just say, give it a requirements.yml file, which specifies the name of the role, the location of it in Galaxy, or on GitHub, like a GitHub URL, and a commit ID or a version number, and it will then install just those roles for you very quickly. And what I tend to do is pin the role, which you probably do on your PHP projects with Composer anyway, just so you don't have an arbitrary update from this dependency changing your code and how it behaves because somebody upgraded it. Right. And also I mentioned testing earlier on. This is actually a little screenshot of the test I wrote, which is really trivial, but it just gives you some idea that Apache is sort of functional and is not totally broken. It's cheating a bit with the curl command. You probably could do this in Ansible, but sometimes it's okay just to write a bit of shell because it doesn't have to be particularly idempotent or clever, and it's quite short to do it in shell. A lot of people have a pattern in the public of open source roles of having a test playbook that is separate to the main playbook in the role, and it provisions a vagrant VM, so you can just run that with a command and it will just bring up the VM and test it, and you get some idea that it's working against that VM just to find simple bugs. You can also go more sophisticated and do stuff. It's much more like a proper suite of PHP unit and integration tests. There's a thing called Test Kitchen, which is an infrastructure to help you sort of create and drop servers at the right time and reuse them, and then it will run tests written in these other things like server spec and inspec, which are sort of, but all these things are open source, but inspec is sort of an evolution or a competitor, partial rewrite of some of the inspec stuff from Chef. But you can use them with Ansible just as well. So those are good. If you like the BDD model, which I heard someone mention about BHAT, BDD is what those two guys use. So you can actually have English language looking tests, which is kind of nice. Or if you prefer Python, which you probably don't because there's a PHP route, you can use testinfo, which is what I use. And I'm not sure if anyone's done a PHP-oriented tool for testing infrastructure. I'd love to hear if they have, but maybe it's a good chance to write one. Anyway, as with any sort of application type test, you can run a whole bunch of tests, and then you get, these 5 tests have failed, and it helps you diagnose what went wrong with your code or what someone's done to the server or whatever. So it's quite useful to have a whole battery of tests rather than just one playbook, to be honest. Okay, so finishing up, how are we doing on time? Because I forgot to set my timer. Okay, cool. So we've still got the Drupal demo to do. So this is just to say you don't have to run everything from a playbook. You can run a one-liner with the Ansible command. So you give it a group from the inventory or give it a host, and you can say just ping, and that just says, can I contact you, upload the ping module, and then it sends a pong back, so you can just see Ansible is basically communicating okay with the server. You can also do something like this. This is an example of that gathering facts stage. It's just saying run the setup task again, like the gathering facts at the beginning, but just filter it out and show me only the distribution, so you can see you've got a CentOS server up there, and Drupal is running Ubuntu, etc. And then finally, another example is just if you're really desperate and it is 3 a.m. and you have to fix this PHP mailer exploit straight away, that is the one-liner that actually does the same as that playbook. If you really, in some cases, you can compress it all into one command, so it is possible. So getting on to sort of bigger stuff, there's a couple of projects I found which are in the PHP world, but driven entirely by Ansible. And this Drupal VM is run by a guy who's done lots of other Ansible stuff, but is a big Drupal developer too. And so it will install all that stuff on Ubuntu or CentOS or Red Hat or Debian, and a nice modern version of PHP, different versions of MySQL or Postgres, etc., and all this other good stuff, including things I'm sure some of you use, like profiling, debugging tools, and admin, etc. And you can actually say which of those you want installed with just a piece of YAML, and it will just install them for you. And it's very easy if you want all that stuff, and it's fairly well tested. I got it working without too much hassle. So it's actually kind of big, and I've just got it as an example of a bigger project. So 37 roles, 630 tasks, and 7,000 lines of actual Ansible code, plus templates and stuff. And how many people here use Vagrant? Okay, quite a lot, yeah. So those of you who use Vagrant, you know what it is, but it's essentially just a very easy way to interface to VMware or VirtualBox and to make things happen based on a recipe for a VM. And these days, a lot of people include the provisioning of the VM either with Shell or with Ansible in the recipe, which is called the Vagrant file. So that's what these guys have done. So now we get to a slightly more hairy demo. We'll see if it works. So one thing you can do is there's an example of the Vagrant provision. So I won't go into the actual Vagrant file right now, but it does call the Ansible playbook in the right way. So sometimes it's easier just to type Vagrant provision. When you do Vagrant up, it runs Vagrant provision for you the very first time. But because I've already brought this machine up before, I have to do provision explicitly. So hence I'm doing that. So this may take a while, but you can see also I ran it earlier and it changed 6 things out of 169 tasks. So the 630 number is sort of all the tasks possible, but I've got a default installation without Elasticsearch and all the other stuff, so it's a bit less. So while that's running, you can have a look at that. Have you got any other questions as well about anything?
What's the difference between a task being okay and a task skipping?
Yeah, so skipping is when there's a condition that they've coded in, to the playbook developer has coded into it, saying, well, for example, install Elasticsearch if the Elasticsearch equals yes is in the config file. Right. So that it's just based on a condition. Yeah. Another one?
Yeah, I've had some like much experience as this presentation, but if you've got like lots of different servers you're running on, is parallelization kind of built into it, or is that a role?
Oh no, it's totally built into it. Yeah, it's a good question. If you just give it, for example, if instead of saying Drupal as a target, which is one machine, if I said web, which is a group of 2 servers, you'd actually see all the tasks being done twice, and then at the end it will give you a statistic which is once per server. So, for example, this server, one task failed, and then I ran this many before it failed, for example, or whatever. How many were changed and how many were okay. So.
Does it just host within groups that are parallelized, or groups?
It could be whatever host you give it. You can just say all. Or you can have, you can say individual, you could always, like, if you have an arbitrary, there are ways of telling it, if you have DNS names in your inventory, you can say match DNS names, so just all the production servers or all the web servers across test and staging. That could be a sort of dynamic criterion. So you can do almost any selection of host you want, and then they'll be parallelized. And by default, it does 5 processes simultaneously, 5 forks, I think it is processes, but you can actually just have a parameter to make that much bigger, and it's just a question of how big your machine is, which is running Ansible. And if you get really big, you can either buy more and bigger Ansible running machines, which are called control machines, or you can just have the pull model I mentioned, where you have a git clone of the Ansible repo down to the servers, and then you can have as much as you need. And it's just how fast is your GitHub. So, okay, so it's getting near the end here. I just want to show you one thing while it's been running, which is when you're running a role, you see where it says geerlingguy.elasticsearch? It's sort of skipping everything because it's not specified, but that geerlingguy.elasticsearch is the role name of a Galaxy role. So it's always like developer.role name. And that's how you can tell that some of these tasks come from the roles which you called, and some of them come from the actual main playbook. Okay? So that's still going. Okay, well, while that's still going, I will just quickly do this. Just want to show you the config file. So let's cut that. So this is the overall default config file. And the way they've structured this is that you can copy this to config.yml, or you can just have only the exceptional stuff that you want. So the stuff you want to change in config.yml. But it just gives you an idea of how you have a slightly more sophisticated config with things like, for example, this is a list which could have a whole number of sync folders that you want in Vagrant, etc. And then you've got a bunch of attributes. So how many people are familiar with YAML? Most of you, yeah. So it's just YAML. like it or loathe it. But and pretty much anything you want to do is just in the YAML. So it's quite a lot of config. But the benefit is it's all in one place. You don't have to go to lots of different config files or different formats. It's all in one place, and it's all driving the Ansible script for you. So it's easier to see what's going on, I think. Okay, and if I also look at so this is just an example of a slightly more complicated script, which has got lots of including variables, lots of variables there. So you can see it's doing quite a lot more. And when we get down to this bit, you can see, so there's a whole bunch of tasks which will run in a pre-task section that run before the roles, and then all the roles that get run next. You can see starting off with firewall and Git and postfix, then the web servers, then PHP and Composer, then the databases, and then you have all the the Drupal, Drush, memcached, and all the optional components there. So the nice thing is you don't have to read all that stuff in detail. It's a reasonably modular way of doing it, and you can see only include the Drupal console if you've got Drupal greater than version 7, etc., etc. So you can have conditions on each of these things as well as parameters to just quite succinctly express what you want to do. Okay. So that one has finished. This is the one that was running, and now it's changed two things, which were probably not very important because anyway, you can see actually. I did actually do a thing. I did actually remove a whole bunch of folders before I ran this, so you can see it has changed something. Okay, all right, that is pretty much it. I'll probably skip this slide, but for those who are into WordPress, Trellis is a really interesting project. You can download the slides later. It's doing sort of 12-factor WordPress, dev to production, modern PHP, really good SSL setup with Let's Encrypt automatically. It's much more hassle to get it working. I had to make some fixes to get it working with Ansible 2.2, but if you know some Ansible already, it might be worth looking at, And if you're using WordPress, and sort of a modern approach to doing PHP from these guys who do some boilerplate and a theme as well. So I just want to close by just mentioning this resources slide. This is like the main book I recommend by this guy called Jeff Geerling, whose roles I use some of the time, but it's generally a pretty good book, and he updates it all the time on LeanPub, which is worth it. Obviously, there's lots of help on Stack Overflow, but there's a good IRC channel, and there's some email lists as well. There's lots of different roles out there, but this guy, Geerling guy, actually maintains a lot of roles and keeps them updated and fixed. They generally don't break too much, so I often use those if applicable. If you wanted to do that Capistrano type deployment of Atomic, sort of symbolic link-based cutting over, then there's a thing called Ansistrano. You can guess what it is. It's a clone of Capistrano. And actually it looks quite nice. There's a 10-minute video at that link, which is worth having a look at. And then the big projects I mentioned are Drupal VM and Trellis. And there's the link to the example project, which is the way to get it going. It's actually there's a lot of different websites in this Trellis ecosystem, so I thought I'd put that in to help. And generally speaking, for best practices, look at Ansible.com. There's a best practices page. And there are some good blogs by people called Lukos and a company called Nilas, who make a good email system. And in terms of general podcasts, I haven't found an Ansible podcast particularly, but Arrested DevOps is a really good podcast about DevOps. If you want to hear more about DevOps testing or stuff, I recommend it. And DevOps Cafe is good too. So that's it. I've probably overrun the time, but we've got time for any more questions? Or yeah? Okay. Yeah.
If you want to boot a cluster, if you want to run it as a cluster through Vagrant, do you then use Vagrant to boot up a whole bunch of different machines and then use Ansible to then provision them after Vagrant's up them? Or
what I tend to do is, if I'm doing a more complicated, because Vagrant could do multiple machines, which is what you're talking about. So you can have one Vagrant file which has a whole cluster of machines booted at the same time. You can probably provision them with Ansible through that as well. I haven't actually done that myself. But what I would tend to do is I tend to run the Ansible stuff separately anyway, because if you run Ansible outside Vagrant, then you're sure that it will work against Vagrant or against a real server. So it's sometimes easier just to run it outside, and then you can take advantage of the Ansible forking, etc.
Well, yeah, sorry. Our DevOps team do have Ansible for all of our live servers, and it would be quite handy to have that. So if you could give someone a test environment that we could say boot up on a testing server somewhere, which mirrors our live environment with fairly minimal.
Exactly.
We could just would you rely on? Would you rather use Ansible to build the machines, or would you have to do that through Vagrant? Is that something Ansible is capable of doing, or is it?
People usually use Vagrant just to build a dev VM on their laptop. It can, in theory, build an AWS VM, an instance or whatever, but most people don't use that. They tend to either use like Ansible or something like Terraform or CloudFormation.
It would purely be just for spinning up a bunch of machines
on your laptop.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on your laptop, it's a pretty good solution. And so the way to do it, think about it, is maybe just spin up the machines with the Vagrant file and then just run the exact same Ansible commands, but with a different inventory pointing at those machines. And so one other tip on Vagrant and Ansible is try to always allocate a new IP address per machine, not a new port number. Because you might have tried this if you use Vagrant a bit. Having lots and lots of different Vagrant machines with different port numbers gets really horrible and painful. So IP addresses are free on your laptop, so just have a new one for every machine. In fact, have a whole range for certain types of machines, and then you won't clash with other stuff. So, okay, any other questions? Cool. All right, thanks very much.